When Daddy died, my grandfather whispered, "Now I'm the one who takes care of the family." The flames that consumed that motel years later burned less than the scars he left on my little girl's soul. Good morning, my dear viewers. What a blessing to be able to talk with you today. My name is Elizabeth Miller. I'm 75 years old. I was born in Lexington, Kentucky, but today I live in this welcoming little town called Pine Ridge, Montana, where the clean mountain air helps me think clearly every day. What fulfills me most nowadays is my work as a psychologist. Even though I'm officially retired, I still see a few people here in my home office set up in my living room. Specializing in childhood trauma, I dedicate my life to helping people heal wounds they've carried since they were young. I started this profession late, at 45, after much therapy to deal with my own pain. It was as if every tear I shed during my own treatment transformed into wisdom to embrace the suffering of others. Today, I'm sitting in my brown leather armchair, the one where I receive my patients. From the window, I can see the pine trees swaying in the mountain breeze while I organize my notes from my last session. There's fresh coffee on the table, and the cinnamon scent I always add brings me comfort that took years to be able to feel. And you, my dear viewers watching now, tell me here in the comments, what little town are you watching from? And what time of day did you find this video? Early morning with your coffee, after lunch, or late in the evening? I always read all the comments, and I'm so happy to know where you're from and when you take time out of your day to listen to this grandma's stories. Let me know, okay? Let's create a chain of kindness. Today, I want to share with you a story that I rarely tell, even though I'm a psychologist and understand the importance of talking about trauma. It's about how sometimes we need to destroy in order to rebuild. About how people who should protect us can be the ones who hurt us the most. It's not easy to talk about this, but perhaps my story can help someone going through similar difficulties. Psychology taught me that our scars can become healing instruments for others, and today, in this open-hearted conversation, I want to show how I transformed my greatest nightmare into my greatest strength. Before becoming the psychologist who helps traumatized children, I was one of those children myself. A girl from Lexington whose childhood was interrupted when her world came crashing down. My childhood in Lexington was like a fairy tale book, the kind you read and reread, never wanting it to end. I was born in 1950, daughter of Nathan Miller, a history teacher at Lexington High School, and Ruth Armstrong Miller, a seamstress who had a small studio in the back of our house. We were a simple family, but rich in affection and values. Besides me, there were my two siblings, Theodore, 4 years older, and Helen, a year and a half younger. Our house was on Maple Street, a quiet lane with colorful houses and large yards. Ours was yellow with green windows and had a front porch where Daddy put a large hammock where we read together on Sunday afternoons. The backyard had a small but plentiful orchard, apple, peach, cherry trees, and a lemon tree that my mother said was miraculous because it gave lemons year-round for her home remedies. Mornings started early with the neighbor's rooster, Mr. Jenkins. Mom made cornmeal porridge with cinnamon that was our breakfast before school. Daddy, always elegant even in his simple clothes, would take us to Monroe Elementary, where I studied from 1st to 4th grade. On the way, he taught us about plants, birds, and told historical anecdotes about Lexington. "Lizzie," he would say, "history isn't just in books. It's in the streets, in the houses, in the people." And he would show me the marks that the Civil War left in our region, the old mansions, the churches with their stories. How I loved those little private lessons on the way to school. After classes, I helped Mom in her studio. She taught me to sew from the age of 7, starting with simple stitches, then showing me how to hem, sew buttons, until by 10 I could already make small repairs to clothes. Customers loved seeing me working beside her, saying I had fairy hands like my mother. During school breaks, we would go to Aunt Eunice's farm, my father's sister, near the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a paradise for us city children. There were horses, cows to milk, chickens to feed, and a crystal-clear stream where we fished for trout. At night, we'd sit on the porch of the wooden house to hear Uncle Harold's stories about werewolves, headless horsemen, and other tall tales that made us sleep huddled together, scared, but wanting to hear more. The most anticipated event of the year was the Lexington Fall Festival in October. The entire town was decorated with colorful banners, and parades marched through the streets with their drums, floats, and flags in honor of the harvest season. Daddy would explain the roots of these celebrations, the meaning of the dances, the importance of respecting traditions. I remember him putting me on his shoulders so I could better see the dancers with their colorful costumes and decorated hats. Those memories are like colorful photographs I keep in the album of my heart. Our life was simple but full until I was 12. That's when the first dark clouds began to form in our until then blue sky. Daddy started having severe headaches. At first, he disguised it, drinking the chamomile tea that Mom made and continuing to teach his classes. But over time, the pain got worse. Sometimes he had to stop mid-sentence, close his eyes, and breathe deeply, waiting for the pain to subside. When we finally convinced him to go to the doctor in Louisville, the diagnosis was like lightning from a clear sky: cerebral aneurysm. The doctor explained that Daddy needed urgent surgery, but in 1962, this type of procedure was only done in major centers like New York. We didn't have resources for such a trip, much less to pay for the hospital and specialists. The whole family mobilized to try to raise money. Mom sewed day and night. Theodore started working delivering packages after school. I sold homemade candies at store entrances. Despite all our efforts, we were far from getting what we needed, and time was running against us. On an August night, while we were having dinner, Daddy dropped his fork, put his hand to his head, and collapsed in his chair. At that moment, he was gone, without goodbyes, without final words of wisdom. Just the silence that remained and was never filled again. I had just turned 13. Suddenly, I found myself having to be strong, not just for me, but for Mom, who seemed to have lost her footing, and for Helen, who still didn't really understand what death meant. Theodore, at 17, assumed the role of man of the house, but he was just a boy trying to look like an adult. Daddy's death left more than an emotional void. It also left a hole in our finances. Without his salary, Mom's small sewing business wasn't enough to support the family. Bills began to pile up: late rent, the tab at Mr. Oswald's grocery store getting longer, school fees we could no longer pay. That's when Mom, in an act of desperation, wrote to the only relative of my father who had the means to help us, my grandfather, Evan. He lived in Bristol, a town a few hours from Lexington, and was practically a stranger to us. Daddy and he had fallen out years before, for reasons that were never clear to us children. The few times Daddy mentioned his own father, a shadow crossed his face, and he quickly changed the subject. 3 days after the letter, my grandfather Evan appeared at our door. Tall, with well-groomed gray hair and an impeccable dark suit, he seemed an imposing and distant figure. He brought an expensive leather briefcase and a thick envelope with money that he handed to my mother without much ceremony. "I've come to take care of my son's family," he said, with a voice that seemed gentle but somehow sent a chill down my spine. At that moment, I saw my mother cry with relief for the first time since Daddy's funeral. What she didn't know, what none of us could imagine, was that this money, which seemed like a lifeline, was actually the entrance ticket to my worst nightmare. My grandfather Evan didn't take long to organize our lives, as he put it. In just a week, he paid all our debts, enrolled us in a private school, St. Mary's Academy, and rented a larger house for us in the Highview neighborhood, the most noble in Lexington. Mom, fragile from grief and sudden financial relief, completely surrendered to his decisions, like a shipwreck victim clinging to any lifeline. "Ruth," he said to my mother about a month after his arrival, "this town doesn't offer opportunities for the children. I have business in Hot Springs and a big house there. We should move, start over in a place where Nathan's ghost isn't on every corner." That's how, at 13, I found myself leaving behind the city where I was born, my school friends, afternoons helping Mom in the studio, the stories Daddy told about every corner of those streets. Each object we packed in cardboard boxes seemed to carry a piece of my childhood that would be left behind. Hot Springs was very different from Lexington. Known for its thermal waters, it was a city that was beginning to transform into a tourist spot, with hotels and inns popping up everywhere. Our new house was in an area away from downtown, a large, modern construction, with 3 bedrooms upstairs, and, on the ground floor, an office where Grandpa spent hours locked up, talking on the phone and noting numbers in notebooks that he kept locked. "These are important business matters," he vaguely explained when anyone asked. "This is how I secure your future." In the first few months, the move seemed to have been positive. Mom was more relaxed without the pressure of debts. Theodore got a part-time job as an office assistant at one of the hotels, and Helen and I were enrolled in Sacred Heart Academy. I even got a new dress for the first day of school, something that hadn't happened in a long time. It was during our 4th month in Hot Springs that I noticed the first changes in my grandfather's behavior towards me. Small gestures that, in isolation, might seem innocent. A compliment about how I was becoming a young lady. A hand that lingered a little longer on my shoulder when greeting me. The way his eyes followed me when I crossed the room. At first, I thought I was imagining things, until that Friday, when everything really began to change. It was early July, school vacation. Mom had gone to visit a friend she had met at church. Theodore was working, and Helen had gone to a classmate's house to do a science project. I was alone at home, reading a book on the porch, when my grandfather arrived earlier than usual. "Lizzie," he said, using the nickname that only my father used, which caused me a strange discomfort. "I need your help with some documents. Come with me to the office." I followed him, suspecting nothing. In the office, he closed the door and showed me some folders. "I'm organizing the family papers," he explained. "I want you to know the business for when you're older." While showing me some documents, he began to talk about my father. "Nathan never had a vision for business," he commented. "That's why you all had difficulties. But you—" and here he touched my face in a way that made me freeze. "You seem to have inherited my intelligence, not his." I instinctively backed away, and he smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't be afraid of me, Lizzie. I'm your grandfather. I'm here to take care of you." That night I couldn't sleep. There was something in his eyes, in his tone of voice, that made me uneasy. I told Helen, who shared the room with me, but she said I was imagining things, that Grandpa was just an affectionate old man. The following week, he called me to his office again. This time, he said he needed to show me one of his businesses, so I would understand where the money that supported us came from. Tomorrow is Saturday, he said. We'll take a little trip. Don't tell your mother. I want to surprise her later. On Saturday morning, I got into his car, a shiny black Cadillac Fleetwood. Where are we going, Grandpa? I asked as he drove down a road out of town. A special place, he answered only, with that half-smile that had become familiar and increasingly disturbing. After about 30 minutes of travel, we entered a dirt road that led to a construction hidden among trees. A discreet sign said, "Travelers Rest, Privacy and Comfort." It was a set of small cabins separated from each other by well-tended gardens, each with an individual garage that prevented seeing the parked cars. "What is this, Grandpa?" I asked, already feeling a chill in my stomach. Even at 13, I had already heard about motels, places where couples went for privacy. "It's one of my businesses," he explained with studied naturalness. "A place for travelers to rest. I have a special room here where I keep important documents. I'll show you." He parked the car in one of the garages and led me to cabin number 5. When he opened the door, I saw a typical motel room. Large bed, mirrors on the walls, indirect reddish light, a mini fridge in the corner. No documents or office. "Grandpa," I said, stopping at the door, not wanting to enter, "I don't see any documents here." "Come in, Lizzie," he insisted, grabbing my arm firmly. "I'll explain everything inside." What happened in that cabin number 5 is something I tried, for years, to erase from my memory. But some wounds are too deep to completely heal. That Saturday morning, while birds sang outside and the July sun came through the slits in the blind, I experienced a kind of pain that no girl should ever know. A pain that was not only physical, but that penetrated to the soul, destroying the confidence, the innocence, the sense of security that every child deserves to have. "Turn around now, you're gonna feel it," he whispered, in a voice that no longer seemed like my grandfather's, but a stranger's, a monster disguised as a relative. And I felt it. Felt as if I was being torn inside and out. Felt as if 1,000 needles were piercing not only my body, but my dignity, my humanity. I closed my eyes tightly and tried to transport myself to another place. I imagined I was in Lexington, in our old house's backyard, listening to Daddy telling stories about the stars. I imagined that the tears streaming down my face were raindrops on a summer afternoon. But the reality was too brutal to completely escape. When it was all over, he told me to take a shower. "This stays between us," he said, while I trembled under the shower, trying uselessly to clean myself of a dirt that no water could wash away. "If you tell anyone, your mother and siblings will return to poverty. Is that what you want?" On the way back home, he stopped at an ice cream parlor and bought me a strawberry ice cream, my favorite flavor. I couldn't eat it. My stomach was in knots, and each breath seemed a monumental effort. "You're special, Lizzie," he said, as if that was a consolation, as if what he had done was a distorted form of affection. Other people wouldn't understand our special relationship. Visits to the Travelers' Rest became a terrible routine. Always on Saturday mornings, when Mom was at the market or church. Always with the same excuse to take me, documents to organize, business to learn, lessons about the future. And always the same whispered phrase that became the trigger for my nightmares for decades. "Turn around now, you're gonna..." At school, I began to isolate myself. My grades, which had always been good, plummeted. I couldn't concentrate in class, couldn't sleep at night, could barely eat. I lost so much weight that my ribs became visible, which only made Mom worry about my health without ever suspecting the true reason for my withering. "It's adolescence," my grandfather would say, with false concern. And adapting to the new city. She'll get better. Theodore, busy with work and his own studies, hardly noticed my transformation. Helen, who shared the room with me, noticed that I cried every night, but her attempts to comfort me ran into my wall of silence. How could I explain the unexplainable? How could I destroy the financial security of our family, who had suffered so much after Daddy's death? Once, I tried to resist. It was a Saturday in October, and I had pretended to be sick, with fever and headache. "I can't go today, Grandpa," I said, trembling under the blanket. "I'm very sick." He just smiled, that cold smile that never reached his eyes, and answered, "All right, Lizzie. Maybe I'll take Helen in your place. She's almost the right age, isn't she? Almost the right age." I never pretended to be sick again. The idea of my little sister going through the same hell was unbearable. So I went, week after week, month after month, carrying that terrible burden in silence, becoming an involuntary shield to protect the rest of my family. It was during one of these visits, almost a year after the first time, that I discovered something that would change the course of my life. While my grandfather was in the bathroom, I saw a folder of documents on the bedside table. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and desperation for any information that might help me, I quickly opened it. Inside, I found contracts, deeds, operating licenses, all with my grandfather's name, Evan Miller, as the owner of the Traveler's Rest. There were also bank statements showing the establishment's monthly profits, considerable sums that explained how he could afford our new house, the private school, the expensive clothes. The realization hit me like lightning. My grandfather wasn't just my tormentor. He was the owner of the place that became my personal Calvary. The money that fed our family, that paid for our studies, that gave us a roof, came from those walls that witnessed my degradation week after week. That night, I cried like I had never cried before. I hugged the small silver crucifix that my father had given me on my 10th birthday, the only object of his that I still had. And it was there, feeling the cold metal against my face, hot with fever and despair, that I began to imagine a way out of that hell. "Daddy," I whispered to the crucifix, as if he could hear me, "give me strength. Help me find a way to end this." A spark of determination ignited within me that night. I didn't know yet how, but I swore to myself that I would find a way to stop my grandfather, to expose his crimes, to free not only myself, but all the victims that those cabins might have sheltered over the years. What I didn't know yet was that the answer would lie in the very element that symbolizes both destruction and purification: fire. The following months were like living in a dark room, where every shadow was a threat and every noise made me tremble. The Saturday ritual continued, relentless as the seasons. Summer, fall, winter, spring. The trees around the Traveler's Rest changed their leaves, but my fate seemed as immutable as stone. At 15, I was no longer the happy girl from Lexington. My body was growing, but my soul seemed to shrink with each visit to that place. At school, I became a ghost, present in the rooms but absent in spirit. My old passions, drawing, reading, dreaming of traveling the world, were replaced by a single fixed thought: surviving until the next day. The constant tension transformed me physically. My hair, once shiny, became dull and began to fall out in tufts. I developed a nervous tic, an uncontrollable blinking of my left eye when I was anxious, which happened practically all the time. At night, I had nightmares so violent that I woke Helen with my smothered screams. "What's happening to you, Liz?" she would ask, hugging me in the darkness of the room. Why don't you tell me? But how to explain the unexplainable? How to share a pain so deep that there were no words in our vocabulary to describe it? And worse, how to risk my grandfather fulfilling his threat to do to her what he did to me? Mom also noticed my transformation. She took me to doctors in Louisville, who prescribed vitamins, tonics, even sedatives. Your daughter is suffering from nervousness, they said. It's common in teenagers. None of them ever asked what was really afflicting me. None of them looked beyond the physical symptoms to see the shattered soul behind them. My grandfather, with his calculated cruelty, found ways to intensify my torment. He began to take me to other cabins, not just number 5. We need variety, he would say, as if he was talking about a restaurant or an outing. Each new cabin was a new scenario for the same nightmare, a new traumatic memory to add to my collection of horrors. In one of these new cabins, number 8, something happened that made my situation even more unbearable. It was a Saturday in March 1965. I had been suffering weekly abuses for almost a year and a half. That day, upon arriving at the Traveler's Rest, I noticed another car parked near my grandfather's Cadillac. A middle-aged man was talking to him outside the cabin. "Lizzie," my grandfather called me, "come meet my friend Walter. He's a partner in some of my businesses." I approached reluctantly, head down, feeling the stranger's gaze evaluating me as if I were merchandise. My grandfather put his hand on my shoulder, squeezing hard enough to prevent me from running away. "Isn't my granddaughter a beauty?" he said, with a sick pride in his voice. "Certainly," the man replied, with a smile that chilled me to the bone. "You were right, Evan. She is special." I didn't immediately understand what was happening. Only when my grandfather pushed me into the cabin and the man followed us, closing the door behind him, did the terrible reality hit me. My grandfather was going to share his property with another predator. "No, Grandpa," I pleaded, tears already streaming down my face. "Please, no." "Calm down, Lizzie," he replied, with that false sweetness I knew so well. "Walter just wants to get to know you better. He's an important friend. We need him for our businesses." What followed was torture even worse than all the previous ones. 2 monsters instead of 1, 2 voices whispering orders, 2 pairs of hands leaving invisible marks on my soul. I closed my eyes and transported myself far away, to a place where there were no cabins, no motels, no grandfathers, no business friends. A place where I was just a 15-year-old girl, innocent and whole. When it was all over and we went back home, I was in pieces, not just emotionally, but also physically. Pains I hadn't felt before, bleeding that wouldn't stop. I locked myself in the bathroom for hours, trying to stop the blood, crying silently so no one would hear. Helen knocked on the door, worried. "Liz, are you okay? You've been in there for so long." "I am," I lied with a choked voice. "I'm just indisposed. Woman things." That night, the fever came. High, violent, as if my body was on fire. I raved, calling for my father, begging him to save me. Mom, frightened, called a doctor who diagnosed an infection. He prescribed antibiotics and rest. My grandfather feigned concern, sitting beside my bed, holding my hand in front of the others. "Everything will be all right, my dear," he would say, while his eyes sent me a clear message. "This is what happens when you don't cooperate." The fever passed, but something inside me had changed. A spark of anger began to grow, mixing with the fear and shame. I began to understand that my grandfather had no limits, that the situation would only get worse with time, that perhaps one day he would decide that Helen was also special. It was at this point that I began to seriously think about escaping. I saved every penny I could get. Coins forgotten in pockets, change from purchases, even a $5 bill I found on the street. I hid the money inside the lining of an old teddy bear, planning to gather enough for a bus ticket to anywhere far from there. But where would I go? Who would believe me? And how could I abandon my mother and siblings at the mercy of that monster? The weight of responsibility was crushing for a 15-year-old teenager. I tried to find help at school. There was a teacher, Mrs. Matthews, who taught literature and always looked at me with genuine concern. One day, after class, she called me to talk. "Elizabeth," she said softly, "I can tell something is wrong. You were a brilliant student, and now you can barely concentrate. You're getting thinner every day, with deep circles under your eyes. You can trust me if you need help." For a moment, I thought about telling her everything. The words rose to my throat, ready to leap to freedom. But then I remembered the threats, the consequences. And more, who would believe that a respected man in town, a successful businessman, would be capable of such monstrosity? "I'm fine, teacher," I answered, swallowing the cry for help I wanted to give. "I just haven't been sleeping well." Mrs. Matthews didn't insist, but she gave me a book. "Maybe this will help on your sleepless nights," she said. It was a collection of poems by Emily Dickinson, an American poet who wrote about overcoming and resilience. That book would become my refuge on the darkest nights. April arrived, and with it a change in my grandfather's routine. He began to spend more time at the motel during the week, not just on Saturdays. "Business is growing," he explained to my mother. "We're renovating some cabins, improving the facilities." It was during one of these renovations that fate placed in my hands the key to my liberation. My grandfather, proud of the improvements, decided to take me to see the works on a Tuesday after school. "I want you to see how we're progressing," he said with that sick enthusiasm. "After all, one day all this will be yours." The idea of inheriting that nightmare place caused a knot in my stomach, but I went, as always, without option. Upon arriving, he showed me the renovated cabins with a perverse enthusiasm. See the new showers, the more comfortable beds, the ambient sound system. He spoke as if he was showing a luxury hotel, not a den of abuse. In one of the cabins under renovation, number 3, I noticed several gallons of chemicals stacked in a corner. Thinner, kerosene, paint removers, solvents. "What is all this, Grandpa?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Material for the renovation," he explained, distracted with details of the new decoration. "Solvents to remove the old wallpaper, kerosene to clean the stains from the wooden floor." At that instant, an idea began to form in my mind. A terrible, desperate idea, but one that represented a possibility of liberation. I remembered chemistry classes, how these products were highly flammable, how a simple match could transform everything there into an inferno, a real inferno, not just metaphorical like the one I was living in. I carefully observed where the key to the storage room where these materials were kept was. I saw when the foreman, Mr. Julian, hung it on a discreet hook behind the reception counter. A small golden key that could be my salvation. That night I couldn't sleep. The idea of fire consumed my thoughts as the flames would consume that place of horrors. It was wrong. It was dangerous. It was criminal. But would it be justice? In my trembling teenage hands weighed the most difficult decision anyone could face. Destroy to rebuild, burn to purify. What if someone got hurt? What if the fire got out of control? Could I live with that guilt? I spent the entire night in vigil, weighing the possibilities, calculating the risks, seeking alternatives, and when the sun rose, bringing a new day, I had made my decision. I didn't know yet exactly how, but I knew that the fire that had for so long burned inside me, consuming my childhood and my innocence, would soon find expression in the flames that would consume the traveler's rest. May arrived with unusual heat for that time of year in Hot Springs, a heat that seemed to reflect the fire growing inside me, no longer just of pain and shame, but now also of fierce determination. For weeks, I observed the motel's routine, memorized schedules, studied the movement of guests and employees. With each forced visit, I mentally recorded more details: the location of fire extinguishers, the arrangement of exits, the times of least movement. In my school notebook, disguised as class notes, I recorded everything. Between math equations, I hid the schedules of employee shift changes. In the margins of history texts, I drew small maps of the cabins. No one would ever suspect that that worn notebook held the plans of a 15-year-old girl to destroy her own grandfather's empire of perversion. The trigger, the exact moment that served as the last straw, happened on a Saturday afternoon, May 15, 1965. A date that would be branded in my memory forever. That morning, my grandfather picked me up earlier than usual. "We have an important engagement today," he said, with that cold smile I knew so well. Something in his tone of voice, a sick enthusiasm, made my stomach turn more than normal. When we arrived at the Traveler's Rest, he didn't take me to any of the usual cabins, but to a different one, number 12, the most secluded, almost hidden among the trees. When he opened the door, I saw we weren't alone. 3 men, all middle-aged, were waiting seated in armchairs arranged in a semicircle. I recognized one of them, Walter, the partner who had already participated in my torment before. The other 2 were strangers, but they had the same predatory look that I had already learned to identify and fear. "Gentlemen," my grandfather announced, pushing me forward like someone exhibiting a trophy. "As promised, my granddaughter Elizabeth. A rarity, isn't she?" The air seemed to disappear from my lungs. The buzzing in my ears muffled the voices, but I could see the smiles, the exchanged glances, the money notes passing from hand to hand. That's when I understood. My grandfather wasn't just abusing me. He was selling me. "No," I whispered, backing up until I hit the wall. "No, please." One of the men, bald with a grizzled mustache, stepped forward. "Don't be shy, girl. Your grandfather assured us that you are very special." My grandfather grabbed my arm forcefully, his fingers leaving red marks on my skin. "Behave, Lizzie," he whispered, with a clear threat in his voice. "Remember your mother, your siblings. What will happen if you don't cooperate?" At that moment, something inside me broke. Not from defeat, but from crystal clarity. I saw my future unfold before me like a horror film. Years and years being used, sold, destroyed little by little. And then, when I was too old, maybe my sister Helen would take my place. The cycle would continue, without end. "I need to go to the bathroom," I said, trying to control the tremor in my voice. "Be quick," my grandfather ordered, pointing to a door to the side. In the small bathroom of cabin 12, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. A girl too thin, too pale, with eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older. That wasn't me. It was just an empty shell of what I had been. And it was there, at that moment of confrontation with myself, that I made my final decision. I opened the bathroom window, small, but enough for a skeletal teenager like I had become. With one last look at the closed door, I went out the window, falling into the tall grass behind the cabin. I ran like I had never run before, with my heart beating so hard it seemed to want to escape from my chest. I didn't run away from the motel. That wasn't my plan. Instead, I circled the cabins, keeping myself hidden among the trees until I reached the back of the reception. I knew that on Saturdays during lunch, only one employee remained at the counter. Young Arnold, who often went out to smoke behind the building, leaving the reception empty for a few minutes. I waited, crouched among bushes, observing. As expected, soon Arnold appeared, cigarette between his fingers, walking to his usual hiding place behind the building. It was my chance, perhaps the only one I would have. I sneaked in through the back door, heart hammering, hands trembling. The reception was empty, exactly as I had expected. I ran to the counter and, with agile fingers, took the small golden key from the hidden hook. Then I went to the storage room in the back. The lock yielded easily, and there it was, the chemical arsenal that would fuel my liberation. Gallons of thinner, cans of kerosene, solvents of all kinds. I took an empty plastic bottle from the trash and filled it with a mixture of the liquids. Then I grabbed a box of matches that was on a shelf. I left through the back again, unseen, and headed to cabin number 5, the first where my torment began, now empty due to renovation. I opened the door with the master key I had stolen from reception, along with the storage room key, and entered. The memories hit me like invisible fists. The characteristic smell of the place, the bed where I lost my childhood, the mirror that reflected my terror so many times. With mechanical determination, I began to pour the flammable liquid on the floor, on the curtains, on the bed. "This is for what you did to me," I whispered as the liquid dripped, forming shiny puddles on the floor. "This is for all the girls you hurt. This is so you can never do this to anyone again." I left the cabin, leaving a trail of the liquid to the door. I lit a match, watched the small flame dance for a moment, so fragile and yet so powerful. Then I let it drop. The fire spread with frightening speed, consuming first the trail, then invading the cabin with a hungry roar. I was paralyzed for an instant, hypnotized by the growing flames, devouring the curtains, licking the walls, swallowing the bed that had been the altar of my sacrifice. The heat brought me back to reality. I ran to cabin number 8, the second where I was abused, and repeated the process, and then to number 3 where the renovation materials were stored. The fire would feed on them, growing, spreading from cabin to cabin. Finally, I ran to cabin 12, where my grandfather and the 3 men were probably still waiting for me, imagining I was in the bathroom. I poured the rest of the liquid on the door and around the construction. With trembling hands, I lit the last match. "Turn around now," I whispered, repeating the words that haunted me so much. "You're gonna feel it." And I dropped the match. The flames rose like furious serpents, licking the dry wood of the cabin. From inside, I heard confused shouts, then panic as they realized what was happening. The door opened violently, and flaming figures burst out, running in desperate circles. I didn't stay to see the end. I ran like never before, down the dirt road that led to the main highway. I ran until my lungs burned as much as the cabins behind me. I ran until my muscles screamed in pain. I ran until the ground under my feet changed from beaten earth to asphalt. On the highway, a truck driver stopped when he saw me, a dirty, breathless teenager with eyes wide with terror and determination. "Miss, what happened?" he asked, pointing behind me, where a column of black smoke was already rising into the sky. "Fire," was all I could say. A terrible accident. He offered me a ride to town without asking more questions. On the way, looking in the rearview mirror, I saw the sky of Hot Springs turn black, while sirens began to sound in the distance. What I had done was terrible, I knew. Maybe unforgivable. But at that moment, feeling the cool wind enter through the truck's window, touching my face wet with tears and sweat, I felt something I hadn't felt in almost 2 years. Freedom. I didn't know what awaited me, if my grandfather had survived, if I would be discovered, if I would spend the rest of my life running. I only knew that, for the first time since my father's death, I had taken the reins of my destiny, and that the flames consuming the traveler's rest were somehow purifying my soul, burning the webs of terror and shame that had imprisoned me for so long. When the truck driver left me in downtown Hot Springs, I walked to a small park and sat on a bench, observing the movement of the city that continued normally, oblivious to my particular torment, oblivious to my revenge, oblivious to my liberation. And now, Elizabeth? I asked myself, as the sun began to set. Where do you go? The answer came like a whisper of the wind in the leaves of the park trees. Anywhere, but not back. The news about the fire at the Traveler's Rest spread through Hot Springs like wildfire in dry straw. Tragedy on the road, screamed the headlines of local newspapers the next day. 4 dead in criminal fire at motel. Sitting in the waiting room of the bus station, with the newspaper trembling in my hands, I read the details with a mixture of horror and relief. According to the report, 4 men had died in the fire: my grandfather, Evan Miller, his partner Walter Norris, and 2 businessmen from Louisville whose names weren't mentioned. The police suspected arson due to the pattern of fire propagation and the strong odor of fuel. Authorities are looking for witnesses and a teenager seen in the vicinity, said the last paragraph. My heart raced. Someone had noticed me. I couldn't go back home, not after what I had done. Despite all the suffering my grandfather had caused me, I had taken human lives. 4 of them. Even if they were the lives of monsters, the weight of this reality was almost unbearable for my 15 years. With the money I had saved in the teddy bear, almost $100, I bought a ticket to the farthest place I could, Missoula, Montana. It was a city where nobody knew me, far enough from Arkansas to give me some sense of security. During the long bus journey, which lasted almost 2 days with several transfers, I had time to think. What would become of my family? Mom, Theodore, Helen? Would they be suffering with my disappearance? Would they know of my grandfather's involvement in the fire? Would they ever discover what he had done to me? Or would they simply consider me a troubled teenager who ran away from home? These questions tormented me for hundreds of miles as I watched the landscape of Central America gradually transform into the pines of the Northwest. I arrived in Missoula on a cold May morning, with only the clothes on my body, my few remaining dollars, and a new name I had decided to adopt, Laura Fields. I had to leave Elizabeth Miller in the past, at least for now. In the first days, I slept in a municipal shelter and desperately looked for work. My age was an obstacle. Who would hire a 15-year-old girl without documents, without references, apparently a runaway? But necessity made me creative. I began washing dishes in a small restaurant where the owner, Mrs. Nancy, didn't ask many questions when she saw my frightened eyes and hands willing to work. "Everyone has their secret, girl," she simply said. "The important thing is to move forward." Mrs. Nancy was a middle-aged woman, a widow, with an adult daughter who lived in Helena. She allowed me to sleep in a small room at the back of the restaurant in exchange for help in the kitchen and cleaning. The salary was little, but enough to start rebuilding my life. The nights, however, were difficult. The nightmares came without fail. The fire, the screams, my grandfather's face contorting in flames. I woke up in cold sweat, suppressing screams so as not to alarm Mrs. Nancy. During the day, any loud noise made me jump. A man with a voice similar to my grandfather's left me paralyzed with fear. The simple smell of kerosene, used to clean the stove, caused me instant nausea. After 3 months in Missoula, when I was beginning to adapt to the new life, I received the first blow of fate. One morning, I saw my face in the local newspaper, an old photo from school, under the headline, "Arkansas Police Searching for Teenager Missing After Fatal Fire." My entire body froze. The article said that I was wanted not as a suspect, but as a possible victim of kidnapping or something worse. The authorities' theory was that the fire could be related to a network of exploitation of minors, and that I could have been a victim who escaped or was taken during the chaos. The minor's family, residents of Hot Springs, begs for information about her whereabouts, the text said. There was even a statement from my mother. "We just want to know that our daughter is safe. If anyone has seen her, please contact us." I cried when I read those words. Mom was suffering, and I was the cause. But how to return? How to explain what had happened without revealing the truth about my grandfather, without incriminating myself for the fire? That same afternoon, I made the decision that would change the course of my life once more. I wrote a letter. I didn't tell the whole truth. I couldn't. But I said enough. "Dear Mom, I am well and safe. I can't come back now, and perhaps I won't be able to for a long time. There are things about Grandpa Evan that you don't know, things too terrible to put in this letter. One day, when it's safer, I'll tell you everything. Please take care of Helen and Theodore. Tell them I love them, and know that, even far away, you are always in my heart. With love, your daughter." I sent the letter to an address in Nashville, asking a contact of Mrs. Nancy to post it from there, to make my tracking difficult. I don't know if this letter ever reached my mother's hands, but writing those words gave me some peace. 6 months after my arrival in Missoula, Mrs. Nancy introduced me to an elderly couple who frequented her restaurant, Margaret and Robert Green. They were retired teachers without children and were looking for someone to help in the house and keep them company. They offered me a room, meals, and the opportunity to return to school in exchange for help with household chores. "You have the eyes of someone who needs a chance," said Margaret, holding my hands between hers. "And we have a house too big for 2 old people." Thus began the second phase of my new life. Margaret quickly discovered that I didn't have proper documents and, without asking questions about my past, used her contacts as a former school principal to resolve the situation. "Laura Fields," she said one day, handing me a birth certificate. "Born in Missoula, daughter of parents who died in an accident. My grandniece who came to live with us." The document was fake, of course, but seemed authentic enough to allow me to attend school and eventually get legitimate jobs. With the Greens, I found more than a shelter. I found a family. They treated me with a respect and affection that I barely remembered was possible. Robert, with his infinite patience, helped me with math and science lessons. Margaret, noticing my interest in reading, introduced me to her vast personal library. "Books show us other worlds," she would say, "but they also help us understand our own." It was in Margaret's psychology books that I began to understand what I had gone through. Words like abuse, trauma, and post-traumatic stress gained meaning. I began to understand that what my grandfather had done was not my fault. that I had been a victim of a predator who used his power and position to hurt me. As for the fire, well, that was more complicated. In the darkest moments, I wondered if I was a murderer, if I deserved to be punished. At other times, I saw my action as legitimate defense, not just mine, but of all the other possible victims that my grandfather and his friends could have made. The following year, at 16, I got a small job at the municipal library, organizing books and helping visitors. The tranquil environment, surrounded by knowledge, was therapeutic for my mind still in recovery. It was there, among the bookshelves, that I met Dr. Irene Madison, a psychologist who came to research materials for a course she taught at the local college. We began to talk about literature and gradually about psychology. She perceived my emotional scars before I even mentioned anything about my past. "Laura," she told me one day, using the name I had adopted, "if you ever want to talk about what hurt you, I'm here. Sometimes, carrying certain stories alone is too heavy a burden." Initially, I resisted. The fear of being discovered, judged, or even arrested for the fire was paralyzing. But gradually, in cautious conversations, I began to talk about a friend who had suffered abuse and sought a drastic exit. Dr. Madison understood the game, but respected my pace and my disguises. These conversations were my first experience with therapy, albeit informal and disguised. They planted the seed of what would become my future vocation. At 18, with the Greens' support and a partial scholarship, I enrolled in the psychology course at the University of Montana. My personal experience had shown me the transformative power of understanding the human mind, both the aggressors and the victims. I wanted to use this knowledge to help other people who, like me, carried invisible wounds. During my second year of college, something happened that would change everything again. One day, upon returning home after classes, I found an unknown woman talking to Margaret in the living room. When I entered, both fell silent, and the visitor stood up, visibly trembling. "Elizabeth?" she said with a choked voice. "Is it really you?" It was my mother. At that instant, my past and present worlds collided. My mother, Ruth, older and thinner than I remembered, had found me after almost 5 years of searching. Through private detectives, newspaper ads, and even fortune tellers, she later told me, she had never given up on finding me. The reunion was intense and complex. Hugs, tears, half-explanations. Margaret, sensing the delicacy of the situation, gave us privacy, although I knew that later we would have much to talk about. When we finally were alone, my mother held my hands and said, "Daughter, I know what happened. I know what your grandfather did to you." The shock left me speechless. How could she know? "After you disappeared in the motel, after the fire, the police investigated everything. They found evidence, photos, notebooks with notes, even videos." She swallowed hard, visibly disturbed. "Other men involved were arrested. There were other victims besides you, girls from other cities." The revelation hit me like lightning. It hadn't been just me. The horror was greater than I had imagined. The police concluded that the fire was accidental, caused by flammable materials improperly stored during the renovation, my mother continued. "No one ever suspected you." At that moment, a huge weight I had carried for years began to dissipate. I was no longer a fugitive, an arsonist wanted by the law. I was just a survivor who had found a way to rebuild her life. My mother and I talked for hours. She told me that Helen and Theodore were fine, that we had received a substantial compensation from the insurance of the motel and other businesses of my grandfather. "Dirty money," she said, "but I decided to use it for something good. I opened a support house for women and children victims of violence in Little Rock. This revelation filled me with unexpected pride. My mother, who I feared had abandoned to her own fate, had found strength and purpose in the tragedy. At the end of that day, I faced a difficult choice: continue as Laura Fields, the psychology student with a promising future in Missoula, or go back to being Elizabeth Miller, the survivor who could finally confront her past without fear. I chose an intermediate path. I continued my studies as Laura. After all my academic documents were in that name, but re-established regular contact with my family, who began to visit me periodically. The Greens, who had become my unofficial adoptive parents, embraced this family expansion with the generosity that always characterized them. When I graduated in psychology, at 23, 4 people were proudly applauding in the audience: Margaret, Robert, my mother Ruth, and my sister Helen, who had followed in my footsteps and was also studying psychology. It was in my final course project, titled Resilience and Reconstruction: Paths to Overcoming Severe Trauma, that I finally faced, academically, my own past. Although the work didn't mention my personal story, every word was fueled by my journey from ashes to reconstruction. After graduation, I specialized in childhood trauma and began working at a clinic for young survivors of violence. My personal experience gave me a special sensitivity to identify the subtle signs of abuse that many professionals missed, to understand the silences and metaphors through which traumatized children tried to communicate their suffering. At 30, already established as a respected psychologist, I made another important decision. I moved to Pine Ridge, Montana, a small town where no one knew my story, but which was at a reasonable distance from both Missoula and Little Rock, allowing me to maintain contact with all those I loved. It was in Pine Ridge that I met Leonard, a history teacher at the local school and a widower with 2 small children. Our relationship grew slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect. When he proposed to me a year later, I faced my last great challenge, telling him the truth about my past. On a winter night, sitting in front of the fireplace in his house, I narrated my entire story: the abuse, the fire, the escape, the false identity, the reconstruction. When I finished, I was trembling, certain that I had ended any possibility of a future together. Leonard remained silent for long minutes, which seemed like an eternity. Then he simply took my hands and said, "Elizabeth or Laura, the name doesn't matter. The strong, compassionate, and extraordinary woman you became, that's who I love." We married the following summer, in a small ceremony that gathered my blood family and my chosen family. I became the mother of Leonard's children, Richard and Caroline, and later we had our own daughter, Olivia, named in honor of Margaret, who had already passed away, but whose legacy of kindness and wisdom I wanted to perpetuate. Throughout the years, I continued my work as a psychologist, specializing more and more in childhood trauma and advocacy for child protection policies. I published articles, gave lectures, and even without ever publicly revealing my personal story, I used it as fuel to make a difference in the lives of other victims. The ashes of the Traveler's Rest have long dispersed in the wind, but from the flames that I once lit in my desperate adolescence arose not only destruction, but also, eventually, light. The light of knowledge, purpose, and healing that I managed to bring to so many others. The fire I once used to free myself became, metaphorically, the fire that illuminates the path for others who, like me, need to find hope in the most desperate situations. Today, at 75, I live a life that the girl from Lexington could never have imagined. My house in Pine Ridge, with its wide porch and view of the pines, has become a safe harbor not only for me, but for many who need a place to heal their invisible wounds. It's been 45 years since I established myself in this town. Leonard, my life companion for almost 4 decades, left us 5 years ago after a battle with cancer. It was a profound loss, but unlike the traumatic losses of my youth, this one I could face with the serenity of someone who knows they lived a true and full love. Our children grew up well. Richard, the oldest, is a forest engineer and works at Glacier National Park. Caroline became a university professor, following in her father's footsteps, and teaches anthropology at the University of Montana. Our Olivia, to my surprise and joy, chose psychology as a profession, and today coordinates a psychosocial support center in Helena. Among the 3, they have given me 6 wonderful grandchildren who fill my house with noise and joy when they come to visit during vacations. Even officially retired, I still maintain a small office at home where I see 2 or 3 patients per week, usually special cases that other professionals refer to me, knowing of my experience with complex traumas. They are mainly adolescents and young adults who have suffered abuse or violence similar to what I faced. When these young people come to me, eyes down, shoulders hunched, carrying burdens too heavy for their age, I see reflections of the girl I was. And when, after months or years of therapy, I see these same young people straighten their posture, find their voice, and begin to rebuild their lives, I feel that the cycle is complete. The pain that once consumed me now feeds the healing of others. My daily routine is tranquil and structured, something I value immensely after the years of chaos and uncertainty of my youth. I wake up early with the first bird songs. I take a light walk around the neighborhood, greeting the neighbors who already know Dr. Laura well, as I am still professionally called. I return for breakfast prepared calmly, usually accompanied by reading the local newspaper or a good book. The mornings are dedicated to my few patients, or, when there are no consultations, to writing my second book on therapeutic approaches for survivors of childhood traumas. The first, published 10 years ago, has become a reference in many universities. The afternoons I usually reserve for my volunteer work at the New Hope Shelter, an institution I helped found 25 years ago for children in vulnerable situations. There, in addition to offering psychological support, I organize art therapy workshops and conversation circles where children can express their feelings in a safe and welcoming environment. My connection with my biological family has been maintained over the years. Mom, my dear Ruth, left us 8 years ago at 91, after a life dedicated to the protection of vulnerable women and children. Her support house in Little Rock expanded to 3 units and became a nationally respected NGO. Helen, my sister, took over the direction after Mom's departure and continues the work with the same dedication. Theodore pursued a career in law, specializing in family law, and is today a judge in Washington, D.C. Always attentive to cases involving abuse and domestic violence. We meet at least once a year, usually at Christmas, alternating between our homes. In these gatherings, the stories of the painful past rarely come up, not because of taboo or denial, but because we learn to honor our journey without letting it define our present. We prefer to celebrate our achievements, our families, the good we manage to extract from the ashes of tragedy. My house in Pine Ridge reflects the person I've become, welcoming but organized, with defined spaces for each activity. My office has walls in soft shades of green, comfortable armchairs, and shelves filled with books and small therapeutic objects, sandboxes, dolls, art materials. In the living room, family photographs and gifts made by my grandchildren predominate. Framed drawings, small clay sculptures, a patchwork quilt sewn by my oldest granddaughter, I kept Leonard's room intact for almost a year after his departure, until I understood that preserving it in that way wasn't healthy. Today, I've transformed it into a painting studio, a hobby I developed in recent years, and that has been therapeutic for dealing with grief. I mainly paint landscapes, mountains, forests, rivers, elements of nature that have always brought me peace. The memories of the past still arise, of course. There are moments when a specific smell, a phrase said in a certain way, or a particularly vivid dream briefly transport me back to that cabin number 5. But I've learned to recognize these triggers, to breathe deeply, to anchor myself in the present. Fire, curiously, never caused me fear again. In fact, I light the fireplace in the cold winters of Pine Ridge with a tranquility that would surprise the girl I once was. Perhaps because I understood that fire, like so many things in life, is not inherently good or bad. It's a force that can destroy, but can also warm, illuminate, transform. My formal identity to the world remains Laura Fields. It's the name that appears on my diplomas, on my professional card, in the dedications of my books. But in family, among those who know my complete story, I am Elizabeth, the girl from Lexington who survived the unimaginable and rebuilt herself from the ashes like a phoenix. There are days when I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't acted in that desperate way on that May 15, 1965, if there would have been another possible outcome, if official justice would have worked. I don't have answers, only the awareness that I did what seemed impossible not to do at that moment with the emotional and psychological resources that a traumatized teenager possessed. What I know for certain is that the journey since then, the escape, the restart, the gradual return to my identity, the building of a life dedicated to helping other survivors, taught me that we are stronger and more resilient than we can imagine. That scars, although they never completely disappear, can become marks of honor that tell the story of our survival. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that our past, no matter how painful it may be, doesn't need to determine our future. That there is always the possibility of a new beginning, of healing, of transformation. This is the message I bring to my patients, to the young people at the shelter, and to anyone who needs to hear that yes, there is life, a good, full, and meaningful life, even after the deepest darkness. My dear viewers, I've shared with you the most difficult chapters of my story, from the dark basement of that motel to the flames that freed me, from the desperate escape to the patient reconstruction of a new life. For those going through situations similar to what I lived, I want to say, there is no survival manual for hell. Each person finds their own way to the light. Mine was as dramatic and definitive as the fire that consumed that place of nightmares. Yours might be different. I learned that age doesn't define our strength, but our ability to start each day anew. At 15, I thought I was destroying my life by running away. I didn't know I was just beginning a new journey. My wrinkles are survival maps. Each one tells a story of overcome pain. When I look in the mirror today, I don't see the frightened girl from cabin number 5, but the woman who helped hundreds of other victims find their voice. Life taught me that even in the deepest darkness, our inner light never goes out. Even when my grandfather and his friends tried to extinguish my humanity, a spark persisted, the same that set the traveler's rest on fire and, later, illuminated my path as a psychologist. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but it teaches us to live with them and still smile. The nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those words he used to say to me, are increasingly rare. And when they come, I know how to welcome them without letting them define me. I discovered that we are stronger than we imagine, especially when we think we can't take it anymore. In that bathroom window of cabin 12, I was just a desperate teenager. I couldn't imagine that that leap into the unknown would take me to Missoula, to the Greens, to psychology, and finally to a life of purpose in Pine Ridge. If you're watching me and carry similar wounds, know that in every place there are people like Mrs. Nancy, Margaret, Robert, or Dr. Irene, good souls ready to extend a hand when we need it most. Not all men are like my grandfather Evan. There are many like Leonard, who love not despite our scars, but with deep respect for our journey of overcoming. My dear viewers, before I say goodbye, I have a heartfelt request. If my story touched you, subscribe to the Grandparents' Tales channel now and hit the bell. Only 1% of viewers make it this far, and you're one of them. In the comments, leave the word light. Only those who watched until the end know how I found light after so much darkness.